She walked right up to me, let her robe drop without breaking eye contact, and smiled like she dared me to look away. But what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about myself. It was a Thursday evening when Jake decided his life needed something different. He'd been working the same desk job for 3 years, staring at computer screens all day, designing websites for companies he'd never heard of. The money was okay, but something was missing. His apartment felt empty, his weekends felt boring, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd done something that made him excited. That's how he ended up walking into the old brick building on 5th Street, climbing 2 flights of creaky stairs to reach the art studio. The place used to be a factory decades ago, but now it was filled with easels, paint splatters, and the smell of creativity. Large windows let in the last bits of evening sunlight, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Jake was nervous. He'd never taken an art class in his life, not even in school. He could barely draw stick figures without them looking crooked. But his sister had suggested it after listening to him complain about feeling stuck in life for the 100th time. Just try something new, she'd said. Anything. You might surprise yourself. He arrived 20 minutes early, hoping to get settled before the other students showed up. The studio was bigger than he'd expected, with about 15 easels arranged in a rough circle. In the center was a small platform with a chair and some colorful fabric draped over it. Everything looked professional and intimidating. Jake picked an easel near the back corner, as far from the center as possible. He figured if he was going to embarrass himself with terrible drawings, at least he could do it quietly. He unpacked the basic art supplies he'd bought at the store that afternoon, still not entirely sure what half of them were for. Other students began filtering in around 7 o'clock. Most of them seemed to know each other, chatting easily about techniques Jake had never heard of and local art shows they'd attended. There was an older woman with paint-stained fingers who moved around the room like she owned the place. A young guy with thick glasses was setting up what looked like professional drawing tools. 2 college-aged women were discussing someone's recent gallery opening. Jake felt completely out of place. Everyone else looked like real artists, the kind of people who understood color theory and composition and all those fancy art terms. He started wondering if this was a mistake. Maybe he should have started with something easier, like a pottery class or photography. The instructor walked in at exactly 7:15. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a messy bun. She wore a paint-splattered apron over jeans and moved with the confident ease of someone who'd been teaching for years. "Good evening, everyone," she said, clapping her hands together. "I see we have some familiar faces and at least one new person. Welcome." She looked directly at Jake when she said it, giving him an encouraging smile. He managed a small wave, feeling his cheeks turn red. "Tonight we're doing figure drawing," the instructor continued, walking to the center of the room. "For those who haven't done this before, we'll be drawing from a live model. Don't worry if you're nervous. Everyone was nervous their first time. The goal isn't to create a masterpiece. It's to observe, to really see what's in front of you and to translate that onto paper." Jake's stomach dropped. A live model? He'd assumed they'd be drawing bowls of fruit or flowers, not actual people. He glanced toward the door, calculating how quickly he could pack up his supplies and escape. But before he could move, the instructor was explaining the evening's format. They'd start with some quick gesture drawings, just 2 or 3 minutes each to capture basic shapes and movement. Then they'd move to longer poses, 15 or 20 minutes, where they could focus on details and shading. "Remember," she said, "this is about art, not about anything else. We're here to study form, light, shadow, and proportion. Approach this professionally, and you'll get the most out of the experience." The other students were nodding along like this was completely normal. Jake supposed it was, for them. He just never thought about what figure drawing actually meant when he'd signed up for beginner art classes. Around 7:30, the instructor checked her watch and looked toward the door. "Our model should be here any minute," she said. "While we're waiting, let's talk about what you're looking for when you're drawing the human form." She began sketching on a large pad at the front of the room, showing them how to see bodies as basic shapes first, circles for heads, rectangles for torsos, cylinders for arms and legs. It was actually helpful, making the whole process seem less overwhelming and more like a puzzle to solve. "Don't get caught up in trying to make it look exactly like a photograph," she explained. "Art is interpretation. You're showing what you see through your own eyes, your own understanding." Jake found himself relaxing slightly. When she put it that way, it sounded less scary and more interesting. Maybe he could do this after all. Maybe he could learn something new about himself in the process. The studio door opened just as the instructor finished her demonstration. Jake looked up, expecting to see someone who looked like the other students, maybe a bit artsy, probably confident in this environment. But the person who walked in was different from what he'd expected. There was something about the way she carried herself, a mix of quiet confidence and genuine warmth that seemed to light up the room. She wasn't trying to make an impression, but somehow she commanded attention anyway. She had a canvas bag slung over her shoulder and wore simple clothes, jeans and a flowing top that somehow looked both casual and elegant. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely with a few strands framing her face, but it was her eyes that caught Jake's attention. They were bright and intelligent, like she was taking in everything around her and finding it all fascinating. The instructor greeted her warmly. "Perfect timing," she said. "Everyone, this is our model for tonight. She's worked with several art classes around the city, so you're in good hands." The model smiled and nodded to the group. Her gaze swept across the room, briefly meeting Jake's eyes before moving on. In that split second of eye contact, he felt something shift inside him. Not attraction exactly, but recognition. Like she could see right through all his nervousness to something more authentic underneath. As she walked toward the center of the room, Jake realized his hands were shaking slightly, not from fear anymore, but from anticipation. Something told him this evening was going to be different from anything he'd experienced before. Something told him he was about to learn more than just how to draw. The model set her bag down near the platform and pulled out a simple robe. Jake watched as she chatted briefly with the instructor, their conversation too quiet for him to hear from his corner spot. He could tell they knew each other well from the easy way they talked, like old friends catching up. His palms were sweating now. Jake wiped them on his jeans and tried to focus on arranging his pencils, but his mind was racing. He'd never been in a situation like this before. Sure, he'd seen art in museums, but this was different. This was real life happening right in front of him. The other students seemed completely calm. The older woman was already sharpening her charcoal pencils. The guy with glasses was adjusting his easel height. Everyone looked like they did this every week, which they probably did. Jake felt like an outsider watching a world he didn't understand. Part of him still wanted to pack up and leave, maybe try a cooking class instead. But another part of him was curious about what would happen next. His sister's words echoed in his head about trying new things and surprising himself. The instructor clapped her hands together again. "All right, everyone, let's get started. We'll begin with some quick gesture drawings to warm up. Remember, these are about capturing movement and basic form, not details. 2 minutes each." The model nodded and moved toward the platform. Jake's heart started beating faster. This was really happening. There was no backing out now without making a scene, and he was too shy to draw that kind of attention to himself. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of going straight to the platform like Jake assumed she would, the model walked directly toward him. Not toward the center of the room where most students had set up their easels. Not toward the experienced artists who clearly knew what they were doing. Straight toward Jake's corner. He froze, pencil in hand, not sure what was happening. Maybe she needed to get something from that side of the room. Maybe there was storage back there he hadn't noticed. But she stopped right in front of his easel and looked directly at him. Her eyes were even more striking up close. They held a warmth that immediately put him at ease, but also something else. Like she was challenging him, but in a kind way. Like she was saying, "I see you trying to hide back here, but you don't need to." Jake opened his mouth to say something, though he had no idea what. But before he could speak, she smiled. It wasn't a polite smile or a professional smile. It was genuine and a little mischievous, like she knew exactly how nervous he was and found it endearing rather than annoying. Without breaking eye contact, she reached for the tie on her robe. Jake's first instinct was to look away. Every social rule he'd ever learned told him that was the polite thing to do. But something about her expression stopped him. She wasn't looking at him like he was intruding on a private moment. She was looking at him like this was exactly what was supposed to happen. The robe fell to the floor in a simple matter-of-fact motion. No drama, no show. Just professional necessity, like a doctor removing a stethoscope or a chef putting on an apron. But her eyes never left his face, and that slight smile remained. Jake felt his cheeks burn red, but he didn't look away. Something in her expression told him that would be the wrong response. This wasn't about embarrassment or awkwardness. This was about something else entirely. She tilted her head slightly as if asking a question without words.
Are you going to be okay with this?
Can you handle what you came here to learn? Jake swallowed hard and gave a small nod. He could feel his hands shaking, but he managed to meet her gaze steadily. In that moment, he realized she was testing him. Not cruelly, but purposefully. She wanted to know if he could get past his own discomfort to see what was really there. The model's smile widened slightly and she nodded back. It was like she was saying, "Good, now we can get to the real work." She turned and walked to the platform with the same confident grace she'd shown when entering the room. As she arranged herself in the first pose, Jake realized something had fundamentally shifted. The nervousness was still there, but it was different now. Instead of being afraid of doing something wrong, he was excited about the possibility of doing something right. The instructor's voice broke through his thoughts. "First pose, everyone. 2 minutes starting now." Jake looked down at his blank paper, then back at the model. She had positioned herself in a simple standing pose, one hand on her hip, looking off toward the large windows. The late evening light caught the curves and angles of her form, creating shadows that suddenly seemed fascinating rather than intimidating. For the first time since he'd picked up a pencil, Jake wasn't thinking about how terrible his drawing would be. He was thinking about lines and shapes, about how to capture the way the light fell across her shoulder, about the confident tilt of her head. His pencil started moving almost without conscious thought. The lines were rough and uncertain, but they were his lines, his interpretation of what he was seeing. He wasn't trying to create a masterpiece. He was just trying to understand what was in front of him. "Time," the instructor called. Jake looked up, surprised. The 2 minutes had felt like 30 seconds. Around the room, other students were already adjusting their positions for the next pose, but Jake was still staring at his paper. The drawing wasn't good by any artistic standard, but it was something. It was a beginning. The model shifted into a new position, this time seated on the chair with her arms wrapped around her knees. Again, she looked directly at Jake for just a moment before settling into the pose. This time her expression seemed to say, "See, you can do this." As Jake started his second drawing, he realized the model had known exactly what she was doing when she'd approached him. She'd seen his nervousness from across the room and had decided to address it head-on, rather than let it fester. By facing his discomfort directly, she'd helped him move past it. The room felt different now. The other students, the instructor, even the space itself seemed less intimidating. Jake was still nervous, still uncertain about his artistic abilities, but he was no longer afraid. The model had shown him that this was just another form of communication, another way of seeing the world. And for the first time in years, Jake felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The session continued with longer poses, and Jake found himself getting lost in the work. What had started as intimidating was becoming almost meditative. Each new pose brought new challenges: how to capture the curve of a spine, the weight of a shoulder, the way shadows fell across different surfaces. During the first break, about 40 minutes into the class, Jake was studying his drawings when he heard a quiet voice beside him. "You're doing really well for your first time." He looked up to find the model standing next to his easel. She had put her robe back on and was looking at his sketches with genuine interest, not the polite encouragement he might have expected. "Oh, thanks," Jake managed, feeling his face heat up again. "But I can barely draw stick figures normally. These probably look terrible to someone who knows what they're doing." She laughed, and the sound was warm and unguarded. "That's exactly why they're good. You're not trying to draw what you think you should see. You're drawing what you actually see. That's harder than most people realize." Jake looked down at his rough sketches with new eyes. They weren't polished or technically perfect, but there was something honest about them. Something real. "The thing is," the model continued, settling into the chair next to his easel, "most people come to their first figure drawing class with all sorts of ideas about what it should be like. They're either too nervous to really look, or they're trying so hard to be proper and professional that they miss the whole point." "What is the point?" Jake asked, surprised by his own curiosity. "To see," she said simply. "Really see. Not just the surface of things, but the structure underneath. The way light works, the way forms connect to each other. It's like learning a new language, but instead of words, you're using lines and shadows." Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure he completely understood yet. "Is this what you do full-time? Modeling for art classes?" "Part-time," she said. I also work as an art therapist at a clinic downtown. I help people use art to work through difficult things in their lives. Depression, trauma, anxiety. Art has this amazing way of letting people express things they can't put into words. That explained something Jake had sensed about her from the beginning. There was a depth to the way she observed people, like she could see past the surface to what was really going on underneath. That sounds like important work, he said. It is, and this is part of it in a way. Most people are terrified of being seen, really seen. They spend so much energy trying to hide their flaws or present a perfect image that they forget how to be authentic. When someone can sit for a figure drawing class, it's like they're saying, "This is what I actually look like." No filters, no pretending, no hiding. And when artists can draw that honestly, they're practicing a kind of seeing that makes them better at understanding people. Jake thought about his own life, how much energy he spent trying to blend into the background at work, how he'd chosen the corner easel to avoid attention. I never thought about it that way. Most people don't. They think it's about the body, but it's really about honesty, vulnerability, the willingness to be real. She gestured toward his drawings. You're getting that already. Look at this line here, the way you caught the weight in this pose. You weren't thinking about anything except what you were actually seeing. Jake looked at the line she was pointing to. He'd drawn it without really thinking, just trying to capture the way the model's body had shifted to support itself in the pose. But she was right. There was something authentic about it that his more careful, worried lines didn't have. Can I ask you something? Jake said, then immediately worried he was being too forward. Sure. Why did you come over to me specifically? At the beginning, I mean. You could have just gone straight to the platform. She smiled, that same mischievous smile from earlier. Because you looked like you were about to bolt. And because I could tell you were taking this seriously, even though you were scared. A lot of people come to figure drawing for the wrong reasons, or they don't come at all because they're afraid of the right reasons. You came because you wanted to learn something about art. About yourself, maybe. That's worth encouraging. Jake felt something shift inside him, like a door opening to a room he didn't know existed. I signed up because my sister said I needed to try new things. I've been feeling stuck lately, like my life is just the same routine over and over. And how do you feel now? Jake considered the question seriously. Different. Like I'm seeing things I never noticed before, even just the way the light hits the wall over there, or how your expression changes between poses. It's like the world got more interesting in the last hour. That's exactly what art does, she said. It teaches you to pay attention. And once you start really paying attention to one thing, you start noticing everything differently. The instructor called for everyone to return to their easels. As the model stood to go back to the platform, she paused. By the way, I'm Alex, she said. Jake, he replied. Nice to meet you, Jake. Keep trusting what you see, not what you think you should see. As she walked back to the platform, Jake realized the entire dynamic of the room had changed for him. The other students no longer seemed like intimidating experts. They were just people learning to see same as him. The instructor wasn't judging his work. She was there to help him improve. And Alex wasn't some untouchable professional model. She was a person who cared about helping others grow. The next pose was more complex. With Alex seated on the floor, her knees drawn up, looking over her shoulder toward the back of the room. Jake approached it differently this time. Instead of worrying about making mistakes, he focused on what Alex had said about seeing honestly. He noticed how her spine curved, how her weight settled into the floor, how the late evening light from the windows created subtle gradations of shadow across her form. His pencil moved more confidently, making bolder marks, correcting lines without erasing them completely. When the instructor called time on that pose, Jake looked at his drawing with surprise. It wasn't professional quality, but it captured something real, something he had actually observed and translated onto paper using his own eyes and his own hand. For the first time in months, maybe years, Jake felt proud of something he had created. Not because it was perfect, but because it was genuinely his own work, his own way of seeing the world. The barriers he'd built around trying new things, around risking failure, around being seen as imperfect, they were starting to crumble. And in their place was something much more valuable, the willingness to be authentic, to learn, to grow. As Alex moved into the final pose of the evening, she caught Jake's eye one more time and gave him an almost imperceptible nod of approval. He understood now that her bold approach at the beginning hadn't been about shock or proving a point. It had been about breaking through his fears quickly so they could get to the real work of learning and creating. Jake picked up his pencil for the final drawing of the night, no longer worried about making mistakes, focused only on seeing clearly and drawing honestly. The class ended at 10 o'clock, but Jake found himself lingering as other students packed up their supplies. He wasn't ready for the evening to end. Something fundamental had shifted in those 3 hours, and he wanted to understand what had happened to him. The older woman with paint-stained fingers approached him as he was slowly putting away his pencils. "First time?" she asked with a knowing smile. "That obvious?" Jake replied, feeling a bit embarrassed. "Not obvious in a bad way. You just have that look people get when something clicks for them. I remember my first figure drawing class 20 years ago. Changed everything for me." She gestured toward his drawings. "May I?" Jake hesitated, then nodded. She studied his sketches carefully, not rushing to judgment. "These are honest," she said finally. "A lot of beginners try too hard to make things pretty or perfect. You were actually looking at what was there. That's rarer than you'd think." "Really?" "Really. I've seen hundreds of students come through these classes. Some have been drawing for years but never learned to truly observe. Others like you get it right away because they're not fighting against preconceived notions." She handed the drawings back to him. "You should keep coming." As she walked away, Jake felt a warm glow of pride mixed with curiosity. Maybe he really did have some natural ability he'd never known about, or maybe Alex and this woman were just being encouraging. Either way, he wanted to find out. The young guy with glasses was also packing up nearby. He overheard the conversation and looked over. "She's right, you know. Helen doesn't give compliments lightly. She's been the unofficial critic of this class for years." "Helen?" Jake asked. "The woman who just talked to you. She's kind of legendary around here. Taught art for 30 years before retiring. Still takes classes for fun. If she says your work is honest, that's high praise." Jake looked around the room with new eyes. These weren't just random people taking a hobby class. There was a real community here, people who took art seriously, who supported each other's growth. Alex was across the room talking quietly with the instructor while she gathered her things. Jake wanted to thank her for her encouragement, but he wasn't sure how to approach her without seeming awkward. The decision was made for him when Alex looked up and caught his eye. She said something to the instructor, then walked over to where Jake was standing. "How did it feel?" she asked. "The whole experience, I mean." Jake thought about it. "Like I discovered something I didn't know was there. Not just about drawing, but about paying attention to things. Is that weird?" "Not weird at all. That's exactly what's supposed to happen." Alex adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "Can I tell you something? I've been modeling for art classes for 3 years now. I've seen a lot of students come and go. Most people fall into one of two categories. They either take it too seriously and stress themselves out, or they don't take it seriously enough and treat it like entertainment. Which category do I fall into?" "Neither. You took it exactly as seriously as it deserved. As an opportunity to learn something real about yourself and the world around you. That's actually pretty rare." Jake felt that warm glow again. "The woman, Helen, she said my drawings were honest. I'm not even sure what that means, but it felt like a compliment." "It is a huge compliment. Helen taught at the art college downtown for decades. She doesn't waste words on false encouragement." Alex paused, seeming to consider something. "You know, there's something I want to show you if you're interested." "What kind of something?" "I have a photography exhibit opening this weekend at a gallery a few blocks from here. It's called Authentic Moments. Basically photographs of people being completely genuine, not posing or performing. Just being themselves. I think you'd understand what I'm trying to capture." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. Was she asking him on a date? Or was this just a friendly invitation? He couldn't tell, and that uncertainty made him nervous again. Alex seemed to sense his hesitation. "It's not just me inviting you. Helen will be there, and probably Tony and Lindsay from class tonight. The whole art community kind of supports each other's shows. But I'd specifically like your opinion on the work because I think you'd see it the way it's meant to be seen." "Why me?" "Because you proved tonight that you can look past the surface of things to see what's really there. That's exactly what these photographs are about. Finding the truth underneath the masks people wear." Jake thought about his sister's advice to try new things. Going to an art gallery definitely qualified as something new. and the way Alex described her work made him genuinely curious. "Okay," he said. "I'd like to see it." Alex smiled, and Jake noticed it was different from her earlier smiles. This one seemed more personal, less professional. "Great, it's at the Riverside Gallery on Saturday evening. The opening is from 6 to 9. But the best time to actually see the work is usually around 7:30. After the initial crowd settles down, she pulled a small card from her bag and wrote something on the back. "Here's the address, and this is my number, in case you can't find the place or have questions." Jake took the card, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Thank you. For tonight, I mean. For helping me get past being so nervous. That's what art is for," Alex said. "Breaking down the barriers we put up that keep us from really experiencing life." As she walked toward the door, Jake called after her. "Alex, can I ask you something?" She turned back. "Sure. Why did you really approach me tonight? The real reason?" Alex considered the question for a moment. "Because you reminded me of myself 3 years ago. I was terrified to try anything new, convinced I'd embarrass myself if I stepped outside my comfort zone. Someone took a chance on me, helped me realize that being vulnerable wasn't something to be ashamed of. I guess I wanted to pass that along." After she left, Jake stood alone in the studio for a few minutes, processing everything that had happened. The instructor was turning off lights and getting ready to lock up, but she seemed content to let him have a moment. "Good first class?" she asked as Jake finally headed toward the door. "Life-changing," Jake said, then immediately felt silly for being so dramatic. But the instructor just nodded like she understood completely. That happens sometimes. Art has a way of showing us parts of ourselves we didn't know existed. Walking to his car, Jake thought about that phrase, parts of ourselves we didn't know existed. 3 hours ago, he'd been a guy who couldn't draw stick figures, afraid to try anything that might make him look foolish. Now he was someone who'd successfully completed his first figure drawing class, earned praise from a respected artist, and been invited to a gallery opening. But more than that, he felt different inside. More awake, more aware of the world around him. He noticed things on the drive home that he'd never paid attention to before. The way streetlights created pools of yellow on the wet pavement, the silhouettes of trees against the night sky, the way different neighborhoods had different rhythms and feels. When he got home, Jake spread his drawings out on his kitchen table and really looked at them for the first time. They weren't masterpieces, but Alex and Helen were right. There was something honest about them. He could see his own learning process in the progression from the first nervous sketch to the final, more confident drawing. Looking at them, Jake realized tonight had been about much more than learning to draw. It had been about learning to see, to be present, to trust his own perceptions instead of second-guessing everything. For the first time in years, he was excited about what might happen next. Saturday evening came faster than Jake expected. He'd spent the week thinking about the art class, finding himself noticing details he'd never paid attention to before. The way shadows fell across his office building at different times of day, the expressions on people's faces during his commute, the texture of everyday objects he'd always taken for granted. He'd even attempted a few sketches at home, just simple things around his apartment. A coffee mug on the table, the way afternoon light came through his bedroom window. They weren't particularly good, but that didn't matter. The act of trying to capture what he saw was becoming addictive. Now, standing outside the Riverside Gallery, Jake felt those familiar butterflies in his stomach. The building was an old converted warehouse, similar to the art studio but more polished. Large windows revealed glimpses of white walls, artwork, and people moving around inside with wine glasses in their hands. This was definitely outside his usual comfort zone. Jake had been to maybe 2 art galleries in his entire life, both times as school field trips years ago. He had no idea what the etiquette was, what he was supposed to say about the artwork, or how to act around actual artists. But Alex's invitation card was in his pocket, and her words from Thursday night echoed in his mind. Breaking down the barriers we put up that keep us from really experiencing life. Jake took a deep breath and walked through the front door. The gallery was busier than he'd expected, maybe 40 or 50 people scattered throughout the main room. Conversations hummed at the comfortable volume of people who knew they were in a space dedicated to contemplation. Jake recognized Helen from class talking animatedly with a group near one wall. Tony and Lindsay were there too, studying a large photograph with intense focus. But it was the photographs themselves that stopped Jake in his tracks. Alex's work was nothing like he'd expected. Instead of formal portraits or artistic poses, these were candid moments that felt almost intimate. A child sleeping in the back seat of a car, completely unguarded. An elderly man feeding pigeons in a park, his face lit up with simple joy. A woman laughing so hard at something off camera that tears were streaming down her cheeks. Each photograph captured something real and unfiltered. There was no pretense, no attempt to make the subjects look perfect or composed. They were just people being completely themselves, unaware that their most authentic moments were being preserved. Jake moved slowly from image to image, feeling the same sensation he'd experienced during the drawing class, that sense of really seeing, of understanding something deeper about what it meant to be human. "What do you think?" Jake turned to find Alex beside him, holding 2 glasses of wine. She looked different tonight, still confident but more relaxed. She wore a simple black dress and had let her hair down from its usual ponytail. "They're incredible," Jake said, accepting the wine. "How did you capture these moments? It's like the people don't even know you're there. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they do, but they trust me enough to ignore the camera." Alex gestured toward the photograph they were standing in front of, a teenage boy teaching his younger sister to ride a bike, both of them grinning with pure excitement. "This is my neighbor's kids. I've known them for 2 years, so when I had my camera out, they just did what they always do. But how do you know when to take the picture? How do you catch the exact right moment?" Alex smiled. "The same way you knew when to make that perfect line in your drawing Thursday night. You stop thinking about technique and start feeling the rhythm of what's happening. You trust your instincts instead of your fears." They moved to the next photograph, and Jake found himself studying it with the same intensity he'd brought to figure drawing. He was starting to understand that both activities required the same skill, the ability to see past the surface to what was actually there. "Jake," Helen's voice called from across the room. She approached with the enthusiasm of someone who'd had just enough wine to be extra friendly. "I was hoping you'd come. What do you think of Alex's work?" "It's amazing. I've never seen photographs that felt so real." "That's exactly the word," Helen agreed. "Most people take pictures of how they want things to look. Alex takes pictures of how things actually are. It's a completely different skill set." As Helen moved on to greet other people, Alex turned to Jake with a curious expression. "Can I ask what you do for work?" "I realized I never found out. Website design. Pretty boring compared to this." Jake gestured around the gallery. "I doubt that. What kind of websites?" "Mostly small businesses. Restaurants, local shops, service companies. Nothing very creative." Alex considered this. "But you're helping people tell their stories, right? You're figuring out how to present who they are to the world. That's not so different from what I do with photography." Jake had never thought about his work that way. He'd always seen it as just arranging text and images in functional layouts. But Alex was right. He was helping people communicate their identity, their values, their personalities through visual design. "I never looked at it like that," he admitted. "Maybe you should. I bet you're better at it than you think, especially after Thursday night. You proved you have an eye for seeing what's essential about something." They spent the next hour walking through the gallery together, with Alex explaining the stories behind different photographs. Jake found himself asking questions he wouldn't have thought to ask a week ago, noticing details about composition and lighting that he was starting to understand intuitively. Around 8:30, as the crowd began to thin out, Alex suggested they step outside for some fresh air. The evening was warm, and the gallery's small patio overlooked the river that ran through downtown. "Thank you for inviting me," Jake said, as they sat on a bench facing the water. "I feel like I'm seeing the world differently than I did a week ago." That's what art does. It changes how you perceive things. Alex paused, watching a group of ducks paddle by. "Can I tell you something? When I started modeling for art classes, it wasn't because I loved art. It was because I was broke and needed the money." Jake looked at her with surprise. The confident, purposeful person he'd met seemed like someone who'd always known exactly what she wanted to do. "I was working at a coffee shop, barely making rent, and someone mentioned that the community college paid models $20 an hour. I figured, how hard could it be? Just sit still and let people draw you." "What changed?" "The first class I modeled for had this one student who was probably in his 70s. He'd never drawn before in his life, but he was taking the class because his wife had always wanted him to try art before she passed away. He was terrible at first, but he kept coming back week after week. Alex smiled at the memory. By the end of the semester, his drawings weren't technically great, but they were so full of love and determination. He was honoring his wife's memory by learning to see beauty the way she had. That's when I realized modeling wasn't just about money. I was helping people connect with something deeper. Is that why you became an art therapist? Partly. I started taking classes myself, then got interested in how art could help people heal from trauma. But the modeling taught me that being vulnerable with others isn't something to be ashamed of. It's actually a gift you can give. Jake thought about Thursday night, how Alex's directness had forced him past his own embarrassment to focus on what really mattered. Is that why you approached me the way you did? To help me get past being self-conscious? I could tell you were someone who thought too much instead of trusting what you felt. Sometimes the best way to help someone like that is to make the scary thing happen quickly, so they realize it's not actually scary at all. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the river flow past. Jake felt peaceful in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Not just relaxed, but genuinely content with where he was and who he was with. I signed up for next Thursday's class, he said eventually. Good. You should. You have real potential. Not just for the art. For the first time in a long time, I'm excited about learning something new, about becoming better at something. Alex turned to look at him directly. That's the real transformation, isn't it? Not just learning to draw, but remembering what it feels like to grow. 6 months later, Jake's life looked completely different. He was still doing website design, but he'd started incorporating his artistic eye into his work. His clients were noticing the difference, and he'd even picked up several projects for local artists and galleries. More importantly, he felt different. The art classes had become a regular part of his week, and he'd started taking weekend photography walks around the city. He'd joined Helen's informal sketching group that met at coffee shops on Sunday mornings. He'd even had a small piece accepted into a local art fair. But the biggest change was internal. Jake no longer felt like he was just going through the motions of life. He felt engaged, present, willing to try new things even when they scared him. Alex had been right that first night. Sometimes the most profound growth comes from the most unexpected encounters. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to challenge you to see past your own limitations. And sometimes, the person who dares you to react to their boldness is really daring you to discover who you're capable of becoming.